Hi, I wanted to go over with you guys John Winthrop's model of Christian charity. I know that some of you probably had some difficulty going through this. I will tell you it could have been worse. I could have asked you to read Michael Wigglesworth's The Day of Doom, which is also a Calvinist sermon, but that one is in poetic form and it's about the apocalypse. So you are welcome. I actually quite like this particular piece. It has a lot of history to it, but this is one of the most important sermons, really, in American history. You have heard the phrase, I'm sure, about 1,000 points of light. That references back to this sermon. City on a Hill, I know, is part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, but it also comes up all the time in American politics. It references this sermon. So this sermon, incidentally, wasn't actually given on American soil. It was given on his ship, the Arbella, while they were traveling to the United States, or what would become the United States. So this was something that he preached on board as they're making their journey, which, remember, this sea journey could take several months. A lot of people would get sick. Some people would die. They're coming to a land that they don't know very well. They're leaving behind the world that they know, and they're coming to a land of hardship. So all of that is context for what he's saying. And yeah, for us modern readers, we also have this kind of language barrier where the way that he's speaking is very difficult for us because just the words that he's using are unfamiliar. So I wanted to go through it with you and talk about kind of the most important points, what he's trying to do in this piece and why it's important. So he starts off pretty strong, right? And he tells us, God Almighty in his most holy and wise providence hath so disposed of the condition of mankind as in all times some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. So he just is off the top saying the way of the world is that some people are rich and some people are poor, and that is the way that God wants it. So he's laying that out as his foundation. And given that the title of this is a model of Christian charity, we can kind of get that the idea here is he's telling us how those people who have means should behave as people of their belief system, of Calvinist belief, should behave toward those people without means. So he goes on and he gives a couple reasons, the reason they're off. So why? Why did God make it this way? It's always kind of dicey to try to determine the reason why any kind of entity that is beyond human comprehension does anything, but that's what John Winthrop is attempting to do here. So the first thing he says here in this first paragraph under the reason they're off is that it just flat out makes God happy for us to behave this way. So counting himself more honored in dispensing his gifts to man by man than if he did it by his own immediate hands. That's what he means by that. So when mankind shares their wealth with each other, that makes God happier than if God just, gave everybody what they needed to start with. Secondly, that he might have the more occasion to manifest the work of his Spirit, first upon the wicked, in moderating and restraining them, so that the rich and mighty should not eat up the poor, nor the poor and despised rise up against their superiors and shake off their yoke. Now, guys, here's where he starts to do something really interesting, and this is where this piece, even though this piece is a sermon, starts to take on political use, okay? Remember, John Winthrop is also a politician. He becomes governor, right? So he is setting up, before they ever land, a way to help him organize peace, a way to help them keep order. Because he's saying this is what happens when there's too much. I don't want to use the word disunity here, but when you have too many poor people and there's a lot of wealth that's being concentrated at the top, you've got two things that happen. You first of all have kind of evil, rich people who don't care about the poor. And in a modern context, that would be kind of like sweatshop labor, that kind of thing that will happen where people only care about getting rich and they will absolutely use up people to get more and more rich. He's trying to prevent that from happening. So he doesn't want basically what you would see in Europe with these lords, where they would have peasants and they would just absolutely use and abuse them. He's trying to prevent that. He's saying we're not going to allow that to be established in the United States, under my watch anyway, in the part that I have anything to do with. So don't think that you can come over here and that you can take advantage of people who are less well off than you to just continue to amass more and more wealth and power. We're not going to allow that. But we don't want to have a situation where you have a lot of poor, desperate people, because what happens when you have poor, desperate people? Eventually they rise up, right? And he uses the actual phrase, shake off their yoke. Well, I mean, ultimately it gets worse than that, right? They start to behead, heads of state and things of that nature. So he's saying we want to maintain order. We want to make sure everyone's taken care of, and we want to make sure order is maintained. And I'm going to do that by making sure I'm phrasing it in a way that is consistent with our religious beliefs. Because what's the best way to get people to do what you want them to do? It's to frame it in a way that is consistent with their religious beliefs. And something that they already believe in, especially that they believe in with all their body, all their heart, and all their soul. It works, right? So that's what he's doing here. And he talks about brotherly affection. He says, oh, it's all God's anyway, so it's not even your wealth. What does it matter? He tells us there are 2 rules whereby we are to walk towards another: justice and mercy. These are always distinguished in their act and their object, yet they may both concur in the same subject in each respect. And he goes through here in this next passage talking about what justice means and what mercy means and how we are to kind of do these. So let's go through that section. He goes, the basic tenets of this are: number 1, love your neighbor as yourself. Upon this ground stands all the precepts of the moral law, which concerns our dealings with men. So every, moral law that we have that we're going to build in this new world for us is going to be based on this idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. And that extends to what we should do with money. Now, being greedy, having more than we need and not sharing it, obviously would violate that. So charity is part of loving your neighbor as yourself. Then he goes on. First, remember, justice and mercy are our 2 laws. And so now he's talking about mercy. He says, for mercy, this law of loving your neighbor as yourself requires 2 things: that every man afford his help to another in every want or distress. And secondly, that every man, that he performed this out of the same affection which makes him careful of his own goods. So he's saying you have to be charitable and you have to be nice about it. So it doesn't count if you hold it over somebody's head forever. I think we've all been in that situation where somebody does something nice for us, and then for the rest of the time that we know them, hey, you remember that time I did the blah, blah, blah thing? And they make it this burden or this debt, saying you cannot do that. It doesn't count if you do that. So the biblical term for that is usury. And then he goes on down a little bit. Remember, justice and mercy. He goes on down and talks about the law of grace. And it says, the difference between Christians and others is this idea that we do unto others, do good to all, especially to the household of faith. And then he goes on and he says, thirdly, the law of nature could give no rules for dealing with enemies. For all are to be considered as friends in the state of innocency. But the gospel commands love to an enemy. If thine enemy hunger, feed him. Love your enemies. Do good to them that hate you. So he's flat out admitting we're going to other people. He's not saying that we have to recognize, indigenous populations or people of other religions as though they are the same as us. He's going to allow them to have, this kind of stratification in the way they think about people and in the way that their society works. He's going to allow them to hold their own society above other societies. Because remember, he says, do good to all, especially to the household of faith. But that doesn't absolve them of their responsibilities to have this kind of functioning society where everybody, including the people at the bottom, are taken care of. So he's doing a balancing act here between what they believe and what is required for society to function well. And he's wrapping it up really nicely in the language of their religious belief. Lastly, when there is no other means whereby our Christian brother may be relieved in his distress, we must help him beyond our ability, rather than tempt God in putting him upon help by miraculous or extraordinary means. Basically what he's saying here is prayer and thoughts and prayer are great. They're wonderful. Please keep doing them. But if you have the ability to help, you have to help. And even if you don't think you have the ability to help, you still have to try. You can't just say, I did thoughts and prayers and that's all I have to do. He's saying you have a responsibility beyond thoughts and prayers, because otherwise you're using God as a scapegoat. That's what he's saying in that passage. So now he goes on, he talks about the duty of mercy is three things: giving, lending, and forgiving. So he explains to us what these mean in the next few passages. So he has all these objections that people say, okay, yeah, but what about, the term for that these days is whataboutism. And he addresses these early, which is a really good strategy in terms of persuasion. Anytime you do kind of a persuasive essay, you should always start by addressing your kind of opponent's objections. Gets it out of the way, lets them know that you have been thinking about their objections, you understand their point of view, and also takes their best weapons away from them very early, so they kind of have no choice but to listen to what you have to say. So he's a very good rhetorician here. So he's starting out with their objections. And the objection that they say here is, we have to save for my own family, right? And he goes, okay, yeah, but do you have to save for your own family even if it means someone else is going to starve? Because I don't think that's what God wanted. So that's the first objection. And then he goes on and he says, he that gives to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him even in this life 100-fold. Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon the earth. They are subject to the moth, the rust, the thief, and they will steal away the heart. Where the treasure is, there will the heart be also. So he's kind of smacking down these objections, which may have been very legitimate objections. They may have been the kind of objection somebody makes when they just kind of don't want to do the thing. But either way, he's thought about them in advance. That's what this section is about. Okay, so how do we handle lending? So he says, remember, we have to give, we have to lend, and we have to forgive. Here's how you figure this out. When do I have to give? When do I have to lend? And when do I have to, when he says forgive, he means basically wipe away the debt. Well, if the person has the ability to pay you back, you can expect them to pay you back. But if they're not ever going to be able to pay you back, you can't hold that over their head. So, for example, let's say that your cousin comes up to you and asks you to borrow $100 and they'll pay you back on Friday when they get their check. You're perfectly reasonable in expecting that person to pay you back on Friday when they get their check. If your cousin who has been unemployed and has 2 young children that they need to feed and has absolutely no way of ever getting that money comes up to you and asks you for $100, what Winthrop would tell you is you cannot expect that person to ever pay you back because it's beyond their means. So that's what he means by giving versus lending. So that's this section here where it says, what rule must we observe in lending? And then when they say, what rule must we observe in forgiving? That's when we forgive. But then they also have this idea of Jubilee that comes up. And Jubilee is based on an old Jewish tradition that is still being followed at this time. And the idea was every 7 years, debts get forgiven. And so that's part of what they're talking about here in this section. If I were, and it's important here that you understand, Jubilee is every 7 calendar years, not 7 years from the time the debt was given. So if let's say Jubilee falls on 2022, if I come and ask for you a debt today and you give me that loan is forgiven in 2022, period. Whether I finish paying it off or not, 2022's Jubilee year, it gets wiped out. And Winthrop is saying in this passage, you can't use that as a reason to deny the loan. So you can't say, well, that's a pretty big loan this person needs, and they're not going to have it paid back by the time Jubilee comes around, so I'm not going to give the loan. Winthrop says you cannot do that. And interestingly enough, most debt in the United States today has a 7-year statute of limitations on it that is directly linked back to the Jubilee period. So anyway, So we still have a lot of stuff that kind of ties into this. It's not gone away. So that's basically what that first section of this is about. He's setting up a world where people who have funds, who have resources, are not, formally required to give it up. It's not a socialist. He would be very opposed to socialism. He says at the very beginning, God wants people to be rich and he wants people to be poor. He set it up that way. Winthrop does not want to overturn that, but he does want to set it up to where people feel an obligation so that the poor people don't get so poor that they want to overthrow the government. And he wants to also make sure nobody is coming over with the intention of taking advantage of the poor to instill, further and further their own wealth. He's using the religious texts that they already believe in as a way to justify basically this political system that will enable stability, and more stability than they had in Europe. And, really remember, they're fleeing these situations. He's basically trying to think of, how can we avoid the situation that we were fleeing? And how can I convince people to get on board with it? Cool, let's use our religion. So it's really brilliant what he's doing here. And then in the second section of this sermon is the part that really we are mostly going to hear referenced in the modern U.S. Now, the only way to avoid this shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of each other's necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work, our community as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies. When he shall make us a praise and glory that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God, and of all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants, and cause the prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are a-going. So, that's a very often referred to section. The city on the hill part especially. Ronald Reagan used that in his speeches. George H.W. Bush referred to that. 1,000 Points of Light, if you've ever heard that, references directly to this speech. This idea of America as a shining city on a hill, and we have to be careful what we do because everyone is watching. We'll either succeed and everyone will want to be like us, or we'll fail and everyone will say, what a spectacular failure. Let's not ever be like them. It's a very, very common refrain and trope in modern American politics. And it's also a super brilliant thing that Winthrop was doing. Not just rhetorically. I imagine this would have been a heck of a thing to be watching as you're on, the deck of this ship that's just completely crowded with, hundreds of bodies. Think about what he's saying here. And think about what he's bringing up. He's bringing up the Black Legend of Spain. Everybody saw what they did, and everybody's talking about how bad people they were and how we don't want to be like them. Do you want them to say the same of us? How they besmirched God's name with all their massacres? And that's what he's saying. He's saying, do you want that on your conscience? Do you want to be the one that failed God in this way? Or do you want to be the one that people look at and say, yeah, those are the people of God. Let's be like them. Well, if you want to be like them, then you'll do the things I just told you to do. It's very clever as a technique. And it also is going to establish, again, it was very successful. The system that he established worked very well. Of course, we're under great strain today, as most places in the world are. But, we've been around for more than a couple hundred years. So it worked. This is a sermon. It's also political propaganda. Always remember, who is my audience? What is my goal? Literature's almost never just literature.